Welcome to the Power to Flourish podcast, where science meets the art of a beautiful life. I'm Dr. Andrea Line, positive psychologist, giftedness expert and coach, and modern-day spiritual godmother to brilliant, deep-feeling women. This isn't just another self-help podcast. It's a sanctuary, a sacred space to come back to yourself. Each week, we'll explore the emotional experience of gifted, sensitive women and what it means to live a life that feels as beautiful as it may look. Because flourishing isn't a luxury, it's your birthright, and your life is waiting. This is the Power to Flourish podcast. What if the thing you've been labeled for, your diagnosis, was actually a part of your giftedness? What if your anxiety wasn't a disorder, but the byproduct of emotional intensity and existential depth? What if your ADHD diagnosis missed something deeper, like the mind of a gifted woman trying to survive in a world that just moves too slowly? This episode is for every brilliant woman who has ever felt misunderstood, mislabeled, or missed completely. Or maybe you are a woman who isn't even aware that that is a possibility. Because gifted women are often misdiagnosed, misinterpreted, or never seen at all, not because there's something wrong with them, but because the systems around them don't understand who they are. Over the years, I have spoken with literally hundreds of gifted people, clients, colleagues, creatives, leaders, friends, and they usually tell me something along the lines of, I always felt like something was off, but no one could ever tell me what it was. And then they sit down with me and I explain their brilliance and their complexity. And it's like a light bulb moment for them, right? So some of these people, many, were given a diagnosis that just didn't fully resonate. And sometimes I've talked with parents whose children, whether they're teenagers or young adults or young children, it could happen in that context as well. But basically, someone's been given a diagnosis. Maybe it's ADHD, maybe it's bipolar disorder, BPD, OCD, right? The list of all the acronyms. Or they were told they were fine, even though they were kind of silently struggling. And what is the result of that? They internalized the wrong story. They began to question their gifts and they lost trust in their own inner knowing. I don't know if that describes a story that you have lived or maybe someone close to you, but we are going to dive into that in this episode. So here is what we know from the research. And again, if this is one of the first episodes you are listening to with me, a little bit about my background. I have been studying and specializing in this field of giftedness and the psychology of giftedness since my early 20s, and I am getting close to 50. So it's been quite a while, and I've been doing this work, both clinical and the research, and now coaching for several decades. And I'm just going to run through a list fairly briefly here. We're not going to dive into any one of these things, but I just want to give you an overview in this episode. And if anything really starts like hitting you and you want me to go deeper on any one of these topics, please let me know. I would love to get feedback from all of you because still in these early weeks of the podcast, I just want to create things that are going to be helpful for you. So today, we're just going to do a little overview, and maybe in the future, I'll do a deep dive. But here's what we know. Giftedness can mimic or mask symptoms of many diagnoses. And it's not that these conditions aren't real, they are. But gifted traits are often misinterpreted when practitioners don't understand the gifted profile. And I will tell you, again, this was many years ago, but I had to create my own path. And I basically did 2 different graduate programs at the University of Virginia and then melded them together to be able to specialize in this, because this is not something that typically clinicians get a lot of training in at all. There's so much that you have to learn. This is like just not part of the curriculum. So it's understandable why practitioners often miss this. They're not trained. But you, as a gifted woman, or as a parent of perhaps a gifted child, should know these things. So let me give you a few examples. Let's start with a very common one, especially today, especially with women, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Gifted individuals may seem inattentive in class or at work or in certain scenarios, but for gifted individuals, it's because their mind is moving faster than the pace of the environment. So they may appear impulsive, right? But it's not really an impulsivity issue per se. It's that they have this intellectual intensity and urgency, and it's more of an environmental mismatch. So that is one example of where someone could be diagnosed as ADHD. They might even think they have ADHD, but that's not actually the root cause. And a lot of times when practitioners are diagnosing ADHD, now sometimes they do a full assessment, which is amazing, but I know that many people get diagnosed like in their doctor's office with like a checklist, which is not a comprehensive way to actually diagnose ADHD. So this is very, very common to get mixed up. Okay, let's go to the next one, autism. Now, this one can, just like ADHD, it can be kind of tricky because gifted women, giftedness, can overlap in some areas with traits being on the spectrum. And so things like sensory sensitivities, maybe having, certain kinds of routines or things that may look as if this is someone who's on the spectrum, but it could be that it's giftedness and it's not necessarily autism. So again, I'm going sort of very briefly through these right now. It's very nuanced, and this is why it's so important to have clinicians, practitioners who are highly trained and understand the difference, because it's important to understand what is what. Okay, the next one is bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is characterized by sort of, extreme highs and lows in emotions, behavior. And many gifted women have emotional intensity and even mood variability, but it's not necessarily pathological cycling. So, for example, they might, because they have this emotional intensity and they have like these existential highs and lows, they can mimic mood swings, they can look like mood swings, but they're coming from gifted processing, emotional processing, not pathology necessarily. The next one is borderline personality disorder, BPD. Now, this has gotten a lot of interest, I think mainstream social media, just in general, over the last several years, again, very different than 20 years ago when we didn't have access to as much information. But borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder that's characterized by this sort of similar to bipolar in the sense of emotional mood swings. And the core of it underneath is this fear of abandonment. So it can come up in rejection sensitivity, emotional dysregulation, a lot of challenges relationally. Gifted women may also show signs of that, right? Some relationship issues, maybe some emotional intensity, maybe some increased sensitivity in issues of rejection, but it's not necessarily borderline personality disorder. Now, with any of these, it could be. I'm not saying that just because you're gifted, you can't have borderline personality disorder or some other thing. But again, it's very important to understand what is pathology and what is not necessarily coming from a pathological root. The next one I want to go over is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCPD, which is a personality disorder, related but not the same. So perfectionism, rule following, intense organization systems, these often come along with giftedness, but they're not necessarily the same as clinical level of obsession and compulsions. But oftentimes I think gifted people will look at a list of symptoms or a list of behaviors and say like, oh, this definitely sounds like me. I just want to say every gifted person, just because they struggle with perfectionism, which again, very, very common, does not mean they have OCD or OCPD. I want to talk a little bit about masking and just generally like misunderstood development. Gifted women are excellent at appearing fine until they hit a wall. So, especially in clinical settings, testing, evaluations, observations will often miss unless someone's, depending on the amount of time and I guess the comprehensiveness of what's going on with the testing, they'll often miss their internal distress because gifted women are masters at masking and they have learned to perform and do well, and they can often get missed in clinical settings with practitioners. And the last piece, this isn't really a misdiagnosis, but this is an important concept to understand. It's called asynchronous development. We talk a lot about asynchronous development with gifted children because, they're developing. And with gifted children, what we mean by asynchronous is that they could be developing very quickly in one area. So, for example, verbal processing, or maybe they've picked up reading and really fast. But then in another area, in relationship to how advanced they are, they're behind. Now, they could actually be normally developing, like they could just have a normal developmental level, let's say emotionally, right, with other 5-year-olds, but their intellectual or their verbal skills are like that of a 9-year-old. And so you have this mismatch. It's asynchronous. They're not, every skill and every capacity is not developing at the same rate. So a gifted adult may have brilliant verbal skills, but struggle with executive function. Or maybe they struggle with regulating their emotions. Or maybe they still have issues with like sensory sensitivity. So if clinicians don't understand this asynchrony, they may label someone as dysfunctional when it's just a different wiring, right? These misdiagnoses often happen, again, because professionals just aren't trained to recognize how giftedness complicates or masks other presentations. It's just simply not really covered in, I would say, like 99.9% of the training programs. And when you're brilliant and struggling, being misunderstood, it cuts especially deep, doesn't it? And all of this contributes to this systemic blind spot, especially for women. This is sort of a side note, but like kind of my little mini rant of how many adult women today, it is like an epidemic, right? All of a sudden, everyone has ADHD. Now, I want to talk in a second about what is misdiagnosis and what can be a real diagnosis. But I think my gut tells me that of all the women today that are getting diagnosed and believe that they have ADHD, for some of them, what they are experiencing has nothing to do with ADHD and could very well have something to do with giftedness. Part of why I'm educating you right now. Now, where it gets very serious is when gifted traits are misunderstood as symptoms of a disorder. It's one thing just to be misunderstood. It's one thing to like feel, okay, like, right, this is a mismatch. Something didn't click right. But what do we do in our society, in the United States in particular, in our culture? If there's a disorder, what do? We medicate it because that's our go-to usually in many clinical settings, right? So women are getting treated and medicated potentially for the wrong thing, which is why I get very passionate about this. They may be prescribed stimulants for ADHD when the issue has nothing to do with ADHD. It's actually intellectual boredom, or maybe it's unmet creative drive, or something in their environment is not matching who they are and what they need. But they're being medicated for it. They may receive mood stabilizers for what's actually maybe existential depression, which is very common among gifted individuals, just like this deep grief of, sort of not living in alignment with their truth. Now that should be attended to, but I don't know if mood stabilizers is really the answer there. That's just my opinion. They may go to therapy for emotional volatility and be labeled with a personality disorder when what's really happening is unrecognized gifted intensity coupled with some trauma history or a lifelong pattern of being unseen. And this, it's not just frustrating. I think it can be very harmful, because when we're medicated or treated for the wrong thing, we risk numbing the very parts of us that need to be nurtured, and we lose, this is the big one, we lose trust in ourselves. We internalize this belief that there is something very broken about us and we need medication to treat it. So again, this is not necessarily a rant about, don't take medication or don't get treatment, but understand there is a high likelihood that if you're gifted, these things, that your giftedness is not really being part of the equation. It's not seen as part of the equation necessarily from a clinical standpoint. And you deserve, I believe, a framework that sees the full picture, not just a checklist of symptoms. So I do want to be really clear that it is absolutely possible for gifted women to be appropriately diagnosed with ADHD or autism or anxiety or bipolar disorder, depression, any other mental health condition. Absolutely. Like, just because you're gifted, this episode is not about denying those diagnoses or even minimizing them. I just want to add context, again, that just too often it's missing. It's just that context is missing. So giftedness, to be clear, can coexist with clinical diagnoses. In fact, when they do, we call it a dual diagnosis, and it requires a different approach to treatment and support and understanding. And like I just said, the problem is most professionals, they're just not trained to recognize giftedness as a factor. So it's either ignored or worse, it's misinterpreted as pathology. And the goal isn't to throw out diagnosis, right? Like, even though I'm not personally working in that world right now, diagnosing people like that, I want to be very clear. I'm using this just to educate you. And if you're a practitioner listening, I hope you do educate yourself if this is an area that, you don't have a lot of education. Thankfully, compared to 20 years ago, there are many more efforts and resources to educate the professionals as well as the clients. So it's just important to make sure it's grounded in a full picture of who you are. So if this has been your experience, maybe you feel like you're wondering like, oh my gosh, I wonder if I have been misdiagnosed, or maybe you feel like you were misdiagnosed or just misunderstood. This whole process can chip away at your self-concept, right? This is why it can hurt so much, because you start to wonder and question, like, is there something wrong with me? Am I broken? Like, or then with this, like, am I gifted? Like, am I gifted? Am I really gifted? Hard to know. And gifted women, we often hold ourselves to just impossibly high standards. So when we struggle and we don't ask for help, then we assume it's our fault. Does any of this sound familiar to you? And then that whole cycle, it creates this like deep shame and disconnection and burnout, just depression, all sorts of things. And you may be someone who's just adapted so well through either your perfectionism and your achievement or people-pleasing behaviors or just your high capacity. Like, you just do it all, that no one has ever really seen your pain. It's hard to see it. But just because you have been unseen, it doesn't mean you're unworthy of support. So here's the truth I want you to hear today. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you for being intense, sensitive, fast-thinking, idealistic, or driven. These are not symptoms. These are not pathological disorders. These are traits of brilliance. And remember, giftedness, it's not just about achievement. It's about how your entire system processes the world. And when that system is misunderstood and misdiagnosed or ignored, it hurts. But that hurt doesn't have to define you. You are not too much. You are not too complicated. And you are not alone. There is a path to healing that doesn't require you to choose between diagnosis and identity. And it starts with understanding your true wiring. So again, if this episode resonated with you, if you've ever questioned a diagnosis or felt like you were missed entirely, I want to encourage you to start reclaiming your self-understanding. And please let me know if anything that I've said today has just like hit a nerve, or you want me to go deeper on some specific of this, like maybe it's ADHD piece, or maybe it's something else that I mentioned. I went through it pretty quickly because again, this is just an overview to make you more aware. But I would love to know if there's an area that you're really wanting to learn more about or wondering about, or maybe you've gotten a certain diagnosis and you're just trying to sort it out. I'm not going to diagnose anyone, but I will certainly help and educate with a future podcast episode if that would be of service to you. So if you haven't started with my Gifted Women quiz, I encourage you to do that. It's not diagnostic. It's definitely not diagnostic, but it can be a helpful reflection tool with all the things that I've been sharing with you here. And you can find it on my website, andrealine.com, or you can find the link in the show notes. I also want to encourage you, if you're curious about this topic and you want to read a little bit more, maybe tap into some articles, I encourage you to go to sang.org. That is SENG.org. They are an organization. They've been around for quite a long time. I've spoken at some of their conferences in the past, and they're focused on the social and emotional needs of gifted people. They offer wonderful resources and a community for gifted individuals, including, of course, for gifted children and their parents. And they have some articles on misdiagnosis and dual diagnosis. So once again, that website is SENG.org if you are curious and want to learn more. And finally, if you know a woman who is struggling with labels that don't fit, or maybe she's feeling like she's too much and not enough all at once, please send her this episode. Let her know she's not alone and there is hope. And if this podcast has helped you feel seen, I'd ask you to please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who you think needs it. It helps us reach the women who are still waiting to hear and understand the truth about who they are, how they've been created, and how they can live a beautiful, flourishing life. Remember, you're not broken, you're gifted, and it's time the world saw that too. Until next time, keep flourishing. Thank you for listening to the Power to Flourish podcast. I hope today's conversation left you feeling more seen, more supported, and more deeply connected to yourself. And if this episode resonated, would you take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend? It's one of the best ways to help this work reach the women who need it most. You'll find show notes, links, and resources from today's episode at powertoflourish.com. And now just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It's not therapy, medical advice, or a substitute for professional support. And listening doesn't make me your therapist or doctor, though if you're looking for a coach, you know where to find me. All right, beautiful one, that's it for now. Until next time, trust yourself, honor your gifts, and keep flourishing.